Whoa. Hello. Mental arsonists. You who set fire not to buildings, but to belief systems. You who don't chase chaos, you engineer it. You don't argue. You infect thoughts so deeply that people forget what they originally believed in. You wear silence like armor. You sharpen truths like blades. And tonight, you did the unthinkable. You took a mafia boss, a king of control, a tyrant sculpted from violence and fear, and you turned him into a therapist. No cuffs, no courtroom, no threats. Just one weapon, language calibrated like a scalpel. This isn't a fairy tale. This is psychological warfare. It didn't start with a speech. It started with your presence, the kind of stillness that feels dangerous. You walked into that room like you had nothing to prove, because you already owned the narrative. The guards noticed it. The underlings felt it. But the boss, he tried to ignore it, tried to keep playing the role, dominant, cold, unreadable. But you weren't here for the performance. You were here to find the crack in the armor, the soft code underneath the monster costume. And you didn't need much. One sentence. That's all it took to start the fall. You're not afraid of dying. You're afraid of dying misunderstood. His lips didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. But something shifted. You saw it. The involuntary silence. Not defensive, processing. He hadn't expected to be seen. Especially not like this. You didn't mention his crimes. You didn't bring up the bodies. You spoke directly to the man behind the myth. And that's where his empire began to bleed. Because men like him don't fear punishment. They fear irrelevance. You took that fear and used it like a scalpel. Not to cut him, to peel him, layer by layer, image by image. You didn't confront his violence. You confronted his origin story. You brought him back to that boy, 7 years old, watching his uncle drag his father's body out the back door like it was garbage. You made him relive the night he buried his innocence and gave birth to his first mask. And the moment you did that, he wasn't the boss anymore. He was a wounded archetype, desperate to make sense of the chaos inside his chest. And you, calm, surgical, relentless, you guided him without offering comfort. You didn't console. You exposed. You opened floodgates with surgical accuracy, dismantling his myth with nothing but targeted empathy and well-timed silence. Because silence is a pressure tactic. You weaponized it like a professional. He tried to deflect, of course. He spoke about loyalty, honor, respect. But you were listening between the syllables, to the desperation under the words. Every sentence was a signal. He wasn't defending power. He was begging for purpose. And that's when you sliced again. You built an empire to escape your reflection, but every night, it still meets you in the mirror. That was it. He looked down, not to think, but because something inside him had just collapsed. The ego, the beast that ruled cities, built wars, killed without blinking, it began to doubt its own necessity. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't strategizing. He wasn't calculating. He was remembering the faces, the nights, the screams behind closed doors, the silence that followed every act of vengeance. You didn't offer therapy. You extracted confession, not for a judge, not for mercy, but for him, to finally understand that the war wasn't between him and the world. The war was internal, and the blood on his hands was nothing compared to the silence in his chest. And then came the pivot, the moment he leaned forward, not in aggression, but in curiosity. The shift from, "Why are you here?" to, "How do you know that?" That wasn't a question. That was submission. And you saw it. You didn't gloat. You applied pressure. You call it loyalty, but you've just surrounded yourself with people too afraid to tell you the truth. You're not respected, you're managed. He flinched, not physically, emotionally. The man who ordered executions with a nod hesitated. Why? Because you weren't threatening his life. You were threatening his narrative. His whole identity had been built around being unshakable, unreadable. But now you were speaking to him like a mirror that refused to lie. And here's the real weapon you used: insight without judgment. You didn't call him evil. You didn't call him broken. You said things like, "You weren't made in darkness. You were cornered into it." You don't lack compassion. You lack the language to express it without losing control. You didn't choose this path. You adapted to it like a wound that wouldn't heal. Each line felt like a scalpel through his blueprint. He wasn't hearing you, he was unraveling. And the unraveling was deliciously irreversible. The way he shifted his posture, the way his jaw unclenched, the way his fingers, once twitching with tension, now rested flat on the table like a student absorbing truth. You didn't destroy the Mafia boss. You reminded him he was never built to be one. You rewired the man, and when the wiring changed, the system overrode itself. He didn't cry, he didn't confess. He transformed, quietly, internally, permanently. And from the rubble of that psychological collapse emerged a new entity, one that didn't hunger for dominance but clarity. The therapist was born. Not because he was healed, but because he was finally human again. And here's the dark humor of it all now. The same man who once ordered hits across nations sits across broken people, listening to their pain, tracing their traumas, handing back their dignity like souvenirs from a world he barely escaped himself. He became the very thing he once would have mocked, not by force, but by you, by a conversation that became an extraction, a dissection, a complete system override. And the world has no clue what just happened. They think he retired. They think he found peace. They think the violence faded. But what really happened is that he switched operating systems. And the virus was your voice. Now he sits in rooms, repeating your lines, repeating your cadence, unpacking the minds of others with the same scalpel you once used on him. But what they don't know, what he doesn't know, is that you're not done. Because if this man, this untouchable giant, could be rebuilt from the inside out, then who's next? The moment that question left the air, it wasn't just rhetorical, it was strategic. A psychological breadcrumb left trailing into the next phase of your plan. Because this was never about a single man. The Mafia boss was just your prototype, the first fracture in a wider system. The moment he folded inwards, repurposed his power, and emerged a softer shadow of himself. The experiment was marked, successful. Now the real operation begins. Because if you can dismantle the throne of one tyrant with words, what stops you from bringing entire empires to their knees? You've already seen the blueprint. Find the fracture, name it, apply silence, and detonate identity. Not loudly, not with theatrics, but subtly, with psychological precision so deep it bypasses conscious resistance. That's what makes it lethal, untraceable, unstoppable. And now you're not walking into rooms, you're being invited into them. The same crime lords who once ruled with blood are now whispering your name, like it's a forbidden remedy. Some come out of curiosity, others out of desperation. But all of them arrive thinking they're immune, that what happened to him could never happen to them. Because their empires are tighter, their trauma is deeper, their image is untouchable. You let them believe that, because belief is the easiest thing to infect. So you sit across from the next one, a cartel architect. Billion-dollar trade routes. Executions streamed in shadows. A man so covered in psychological armor, even his own children refer to him by title. He doesn't fear death. He only fears irrelevance. And when you speak your first sentence, you tailor it like a sniper lines up a shot. You've mastered control over everyone, except the voices in your own head. And just like that, he flinches, not externally, internally. Micro-expressions, pupil dilation, the jaw twitch. Indicators of a reality he spent decades burying, now pulled into the light without force. You don't dig, you don't push. You simply create the space for gravity to do its job. And gravity always wins. He talks, you observe. He defends, you mirror. He postures, you reflect. Until slowly, the conversations begin to curve inward. They always do. Because even monsters bleed if you know where to look. He mentions his brother. Then he stumbles. You catch it. You weren't the eldest, but you became the protector. That wasn't ambition, that was survival. The silence that follows isn't emptiness, it's collapse. In that moment, his empire doesn't matter. The millions, the soldiers, the crimes, none of it shields him from recognition. You didn't speak to his persona. You located the scar beneath it. And once you speak to the scar, the mask no longer fits. That's the power most people never understand. This isn't therapy. This is psychological exorcism. And now he's pacing, not to intimidate, but because the walls in his mind are reshuffling. He's trying to remember how to breathe without holding his ribcage tight. He's trying to understand how a stranger just unlocked his guilt like a code he never shared. You sit, calm, still, because movement would be a mistake. This isn't your chaos, this is his. You've simply provided the mirror. That's when he stops pacing, and the voice changes from dominance to inquiry, from performance to vulnerability. Do you believe someone like me can actually change? And that's your entry point. You lean in, not physically, psychologically, and you say, it's not about changing. It's about remembering who you were before the world taught you how to survive. He doesn't respond, he absorbs. That's when you know the second domino has fallen. It keeps happening. One by one, syndicate heads, arms traffickers, extortion kings, men who once made pain a business now sit across from you with empty hands and full hearts. Not because they've turned saintly, but because you made their previous identities obsolete. You didn't change them, you evolved them. And behind it all, you're not just having conversations, you're conducting experiments. You're mapping trauma patterns like blueprints. You're identifying the common virus in every tyrant, a corrupted origin story. And once you trace it, you overwrite it. But there's more. You're not just flipping monsters into mentors. You're building something, a network, an underground mirror society. Because what better therapy than someone who's seen the abyss firsthand? Who better to dismantle pain than those who once engineered it? You don't rehabilitate criminals. You recruit clarity vessels. You create a new breed, reflected operators. People who've been stripped down and rebuilt, not for redemption, but for realignment. And it spreads, quietly, efficiently, globally. Mafia bosses now run mental health clinics. Cartel lords become anonymous grief counselors. Black market architects now sit in underground rooms decoding trauma for lost souls. It's not reformation, it's redistribution of power. Because healing in the right hands becomes a weapon. And make no mistake, you're not doing this out of kindness. This isn't about justice, this is about balance. The world has been run by fear for centuries. You're simply converting fear capital into empathy currency, and the exchange rate is brutal. Because now, no one sees it coming. The governments don't know who to chase, because your network wears no colors, carries no guns, and builds no armies. The therapists can't comprehend it, because these men weren't trained in universities. They were trained by you, and the enemies you once had, they've gone silent because some of them are sitting in your rooms now, asking questions, begging to be understood. And every time you begin, you start with the same line. You're not broken, you're misaligned. It's not philosophy, it's algorithm. You've cracked the formula to identity reversal. And the deeper you go, the clearer the pattern becomes, that every tyrant is born from a single moment they couldn't process. And every moment, once excavated, can be rewired. But now the real question emerges, not who's next, but who's watching. Because movements like this don't go unnoticed forever. And somewhere, behind cold screens and boardroom doors, those who rely on the fear you've dismantled, they're paying attention. Because your influence doesn't look like revolution, it looks like redirection. You're not setting fire to the world. You're rewiring its architects. And now, the attention is turning, not just from the broken, but from the powerful. Those whose control depends on unresolved trauma. Those who built empires by selling pain in packages labeled protection. Those who see your work not as healing, but as threat. Because if monsters can be turned back into humans, what happens to those who profit from monsters staying monsters? You already know the answer. That's why you've gone deeper. That's why your sessions are encrypted. Why your network is layered in identity shadows. Why every operator in your system isn't just a survivor. They're a sentient weapon, repurposed for alignment. And what's coming next isn't therapy. It's strategic repurposing at scale. Entire organizations built not on ideology, but on internal clarity. Not loyalty based in fear, but conviction based in truth. You're not leading a movement. You're orchestrating an evolution, one silent identity collapse at a time. And the world still doesn't know. They think the violence is dying down. They think peace is returning. They think the wolves have disappeared. But you know better. The wolves aren't gone. They've evolved. And now, instead of devouring the broken, they're guiding them. But the pattern hasn't finished unfolding yet. The third layer is coming. The final shift. The one that doesn't just flip monsters or redirect power. It rewrites the entire architecture of dominance itself. And you've already begun. Because what started as an experiment, turning one man with blood-stained knuckles and a frozen conscience into a vessel for clarity, wasn't just a feat of psychological manipulation. It was proof. Proof that the blueprint of power could be hacked. That the institutions of fear weren't invincible. That what we thought was unchangeable was just unchallenged. You didn't preach to the broken. You decoded them. You didn't attack power. You retranslated it. And in doing so, you didn't just dismantle one empire. You infected 1,000 systems, slowly, subtly, silently, because no one noticed when it began. No alarms, no explosions, just a shift, a crack. The first time he paused mid-sentence, the former boss, and looked inward instead of outward. That pause was the beginning of an earthquake. But what no one realized, not even your earliest subjects, is that you weren't just reprogramming individuals. You were injecting new DNA into the bloodstream of control. And once a former Mafia boss becomes a therapist, once the executioner starts healing, once the tyrant starts listening, the world loses its compass. And that confusion? You engineered it. Because now the question echoes like a ritual in hallways once ruled by fear. If he changed, then what are we still hiding from? You didn't just rewire the man. You shattered the mythology of permanence. That was your true act of violence. The idea that no identity is untouchable, that even the darkest symbols of brutality can become guides of depth, that a man raised on death can now be the one holding others through their pain. They feared him. Now they follow his words like scripture, not because he's different, but because he speaks with the weight of someone who knows both sides. The streets used to tremble when he entered. Now they open up. Because he's not carrying death anymore. He's carrying the blueprint of how not to become it. And you gave him the language. You turned him from blade to mirror. And the world isn't ready for this shift. Because redemption was never supposed to look like this. It was supposed to be quiet, shameful, and tucked away. Not loud, not powerful, not contagious. But now it's everywhere. Cartels sending their lieutenants for sessions. Enforcers speaking to youth about trauma, not tactics. The worst of the worst becoming lighthouses. Why? Because you didn't sell hope. You installed clarity. And clarity doesn't beg to be followed, it commands. This isn't about turning monsters soft. This is about giving monsters vision. About redirecting rage into reflection, about converting fear into strategy. And now, you stand in the middle of a world that's cracking at the seams. Because the ones who used to run empires from the shadows now light candles in underground rooms filled with ex-predators, each whispering truths too raw for daylight. You created something far more dangerous than rebellion. You created a mirror army, men who've done the unthinkable and understood it, men who used to use violence as punctuation, now listening more than they speak, men who still have the scars, but now treat them as syllables in a new dialect of power. Because you didn't just change a man, you changed the meaning of power itself. What once came from fear now comes from understanding. What once demanded silence now invites conversation. What once punished emotion now uses it as currency. And that's the threat. Not the violence, but the clarity. You didn't convert them, you upgraded them. From brute force to emotional architects. From puppets of pain to orchestrators of introspection. And now, they're untraceable. Because you didn't build a movement. You constructed a phantom framework, invisible, relentless, viral. They're in prisons, they're in councils, they're in tech firms, halfway houses, recovery centers, and financial circles. They don't wear badges, they carry awareness like an aura. No chants, no slogans, no flags, just transformation that speaks for itself. And the elites hate it. Because when fear no longer works, when threats no longer control, when identity is fluid and upgradable, the old empires collapse. That's what you built. Not a reformed Mafia boss, a living glitch in the operating system of dominance. And now that glitch has cloned itself. Governments don't know what to do with them. Corporations can't control them. And old syndicates? They watch with paranoia because their icons have switched sides. But this was always the plan. You didn't need revolutions. You needed infections. You needed one seed planted inside the heart of someone they thought was beyond saving all to prove that identity is a weapon only if it stays unexamined. And when he broke, not from defeat, but from awareness, the chain reaction began. He's not the only one anymore, not even close. There's a network now, a silent protocol, whispers in prisons, letters passed hand to hand. Encrypted recordings shared like forbidden magic. They're using your phrases. They're applying your frameworks. They're quoting your mindset. And with every session, every group, every one-on-one conversation, where a former predator becomes a navigator of healing, the system shakes. Because you didn't just change a man. You changed the meaning of power itself. What once came from fear now comes from understanding. What once demanded silence now invites conversation. What once punished emotion now uses it as currency. And that's the threat. Not the violence, but the clarity. You didn't convert them. You upgraded them. From brute force to emotional architects. From puppets of pain to orchestrators of introspection. And now, they're untraceable. Because you didn't build a movement. You constructed a phantom framework. Invisible, relentless, viral. They're in prisons. They're in councils. They're in tech firms, halfway houses, recovery centers, and financial circles. They don't wear badges. They carry awareness like an aura. No chants, no slogans, no flags. Just transformation that speaks for itself. And the elites hate it. Because when fear no longer works, when threats no longer control, when identity is fluid and upgradable, the old empires collapse. That's what you built. Not a reformed mafia boss, a living glitch in the operating system of dominance, and now that glitch has cloned itself. The man they once feared isn't gone. He's still there. But now he's decoding pain, not executing orders, and that contradiction terrifies the establishment. They whisper now. Wait, this is impossible. You turned a mafia boss into a therapist with words. But it's too late. He's already helped hundreds, and they, in turn, help thousands. The cycle won't reverse. You didn't just change the game. You corrupted the operating system. And every time someone says, "This can't be real," another ex-tyrant speaks in that same tone, slow, calm, intentional, and asks, "What are you most afraid to admit to yourself?" Because that's your signature, isn't it? You didn't offer comfort. You offered confrontation, delivered in velvet, soft words, sharp meanings, no resistance, just revelation. And it worked. Because somewhere in that mafia boss, buried beneath blood, guilt, and armor, was a man who never wanted to be the villain. You didn't turn him into something new. You reminded him of what was always there, the reflection he avoided, the scream behind the silence. You didn't heal him. You weaponized his awareness. And now, he's not just a therapist. He's a vessel, a transmitter of your virus. And this virus is truth, hard truth, unforgiving truth. Truth that peels off ego like acid and leaves only essence. And essence can't be controlled, can't be manipulated. It is, so now. The systems panic. The puppet masters pull harder. The old voices scream louder. But none of it works. Because the man who once pulled triggers now pulls people out of darkness. Because the man who once silenced truth now guides others into it. And all it took was one person who dared to speak the language of mirrors instead of masks. One person who didn't try to fix him, but simply asked the right questions, patiently, relentlessly, precisely. That person was you. And you didn't save him. You unlocked him. And in unlocking him, you fractured an entire era. So the next time someone hears his story and says, "Wait, this is impossible," let them say it. Because by the time they finish that sentence, they'll be sitting across from someone who looks like them, talking like him, and thinking like you. And that's when the system dies, not with fire, not with war, but with realization. The realization that the most dangerous transformation doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from redirection. And in the right hands, redirection becomes the weapon that outlives every throne. You didn't create peace. You created power with a conscience. And now, the world can never go back.